It was a cold morning, the kind where the wind bites through even the thickest of sweaters. Miss Clara Evans walked into her classroom, clutching a stack of papers against her chest. The heater in the small school barely worked, but the room was filled with the quiet murmur of students settling into their seats. She took a deep breath, pushing aside her exhaustion. Teaching had always been her passion, but lately she had been struggling. The pay was barely enough to cover her own expenses. Yet every day she showed up with a warm smile, determined to make a difference. As she moved through the rows of desks, her eyes landed on a boy in the back corner, Daniel Carter. He was always quiet, always alone. His uniform was worn, his shoes barely holding together, and his school supplies were second-hand. Miss Evans had noticed how he often stayed behind after class, pretending to go through his notes, when in reality, he was waiting for most of the other kids to leave before making his way home. She knew what that meant. She had seen it before. One afternoon, she called him over after school. "Daniel, do you have a moment?" Her voice was gentle, careful not to startle him. He hesitated, but walked up to her desk. "I've noticed you've been having trouble keeping up with your work," she said. "Is everything okay at home?" Daniel shifted on his feet, his fingers gripping the strap of his old backpack. I'm trying." "Miss Evans," he muttered. "But things are hard." She waited, giving him time. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes, something she had seen in students before. A silent struggle, the weight of problems too big for a child to carry. That evening, she made a decision. She found out from the school administration that Daniel's tuition was months overdue. His mother, a single parent, had been trying to keep up, but life had thrown too many challenges her way. Without hesitation, Miss Evans took out a portion of her savings, money she had set aside for emergencies, and paid his fees. It wasn't much, but she knew it meant everything to him. She never told Daniel what she had done. She simply continued, teaching, offering him encouragement, making sure he had everything he needed in class. Slowly, he started to change. His grades improved, his confidence grew, and for the first time, he allowed himself to dream of a future beyond the struggles of today. Years passed. Daniel graduated. Life took him in directions Miss Evans could only hope were good. She never expected anything in return. In fact, she rarely thought about it. That was the nature of teaching, giving without expecting. But life has a way of coming full circle. One evening, years later, Miss Evans found herself sitting in a dimly lit hospital waiting room. She was older now, her once dark hair streaked with grey. The years had not been kind. After dedicating her life to her students, retirement had left her struggling. Her savings had run out faster than she had planned. And when health issues arose, she found herself alone, with nowhere to turn. She clutched the hospital bill in her hands, staring at the numbers that seemed impossible to pay. The doctors had been kind, but kindness didn't cover expenses. The weight of it all pressed down on her. Then a voice called her name. "Miss Evans?" She looked up, startled. A tall man stood before her, dressed in a sharp suit, his face familiar, yet changed by time. For a moment, she struggled to place him, and then realization dawned. It was Daniel. But before she could speak, he stepped closer, his expression filled with something she couldn't quite place. Then, he said words that would change everything. "You once helped me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." What happened next was something Miss Evans never could have imagined. Miss Evans felt her breath catch in her throat. The boy she had once known, the quiet student who sat in the back of her classroom, afraid to ask for help, was now standing before her as a grown man. He was no longer the child she had worried about. No longer the student struggling to keep up with his studies. Instead, he was confident, successful, and looking at her with the same kind eyes she had once looked at him with. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The years had worn her down, and life had made her believe that people moved on, that kindness was given and then forgotten. But here he was, and his words, "Now it's my turn," echoed in her mind. Daniel could see the hesitation in her eyes, the way she clutched the hospital bill, as if it carried the weight of the world. He understood that look. He had wanted himself once. Without waiting for her to argue, he gently took the paper from her hands and glanced at the amount. His jaw tightened. He knew what it was like to struggle, to feel helpless, and he wasn't about to let the woman who had changed his life go through that alone. "You don't have to worry about this," he said, his voice steady. "I'll take care of everything." Miss Evans shook her head. "Daniel, I can't ask you to do that. You don't owe me anything. You didn't ask me for anything back then either," he said softly. "You just helped me because it was the right thing to do. Now I'm doing the same for you." She wanted to protest, but deep down, a part of her was relieved. For so long, she had carried the burden alone. For once, someone was reaching out a hand to help her. As the days passed, Daniel made sure she received the best medical care. He visited her every evening after work, sometimes bringing flowers, other times just sitting with her, reminiscing about old times. He told her about his life, how he had worked hard, gotten a scholarship, and built a successful business. He had never forgotten her kindness. But as much as Miss Evans was grateful, a lingering question remained in her mind. "Why, Daniel?" she asked one evening as they sat by the hospital window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "Why go to such lengths for me?" He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something deeper than gratitude. "You saved me," he said, "not just by paying my fees, but by believing in me. When no one else did, you made me feel like I mattered. That changed everything." She listened, her heart swelling. She had never thought much about it back then. She had simply done what she believed was right. But now, she saw the impact of that small act of kindness. However, the story was far from over. One evening, as Daniel was leaving the hospital, he received a call. It was from his office. There had been an issue with one of his business deals. A competitor had pulled something unexpected, and Daniel's company was facing a crisis. If he didn't act fast, everything he had worked for could fall apart. For the first time in years, he felt the same helplessness he had once known as a child. Miss Evans noticed the change in him the next time he visited. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He still brought flowers, still sat by her side, but there was something heavy weighing on him. "What's wrong, Daniel?" she asked. He hesitated, not wanting to burden her, but she gave him the same patience. Look, she used to give him in class, the one that told him it was okay to speak, so he did. He told her everything. As he spoke, Miss Evans listened carefully. When he was done, she reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "You'll get through this," she said. "I've seen you face struggles before. You're strong, Daniel. You'll find a way." Her words, simple yet powerful, settled something inside him. Daniel knew that just as she had once believed in him, he had to believe in himself. But what he didn't know was that the challenges ahead would test him more than anything he had ever faced before. Daniel took a deep breath as he left the hospital that night. The weight of his business problems pressed heavily on his shoulders. But somehow, Miss Evans' words had given him strength. She had seen him at his weakest before, and now, when he felt himself slipping again, her belief in him was like a lifeline. The next few days were a blur. Daniel barely slept, working tirelessly to find a way to save his company. Every call, every meeting, every decision was a battle. Investors were losing confidence, and his competitors were circling, waiting for him to fail. The pressure was immense, but he refused to give up. He had come too far, fought too hard. Yet, even in the middle of all the chaos, he never missed a visit to Miss Evans. She had always been his quiet anchor, reminding him of where he came from and what truly mattered. One evening, after another grueling day, he sat by her hospital bed, exhaustion evident in his eyes. Miss Evans studied him carefully before speaking. "You know," she said softly, "when you were my student, I used to worry about you. I wondered if life would be fair to you, if you'd find your way." Daniel looked up, surprised, and she smiled. "You did. Even now, no matter how hard things get, you keep going. That's what makes you different, Daniel. You never stop fighting." Her words struck something deep within him. The next morning, with renewed determination, Daniel made one final move. He took a bold risk, one that no one expected. Instead of trying to outplay his competitor, he reached out directly. He proposed a partnership, turning what could have been his downfall into an opportunity. It was a gamble, but one built on strategy and trust. Days passed in tense silence as he waited for a response. Then the call came. The deal was accepted. Just like that, everything shifted. His company was saved, his position secured. The crisis that had threatened to take everything from him was now a stepping stone to something even greater. That evening, as he walked into the hospital, he held a small bouquet of flowers, Miss Evans' favorite ones. When she saw him, she already knew. "You did it," she said, a proud smile spreading across her face. He nodded, placing the flowers beside her. "Because you reminded me who I am." There was a long silence between them, filled with understanding. They had both faced their struggles, both fought battles life had thrown at them. But in the end, kindness had come full circle. "You once changed my life, Miss Evans," Daniel said quietly. "And now I hope I've done the same for you." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. More than you know. The hospital lights cast a warm glow around them as they sat together, their bond unbreakable. The boy she had once helped had grown into a man who had saved her in return, and in that moment, they both knew. Sometimes the kindness you give to the world finds its way back to you when you need it most.